Pokemon Gold and Silver. Ugh. Oh yes, ladies and gentlemen. The perfect intro to perfectly convey my feelings for Gold and Silver. See, you'd hope for the third mainline games, birthing the second generation of Pokemon, to be better than the games to come prior. And while it could be seen that way on some fronts, like mechanical improvements, so much was done wrong in terms of actually playing through the game. That makes it one of, if not the biggest drag in the entire series. And the reasons we'll speak on today are what make these games into a bottom 5 Pokemon experience, despite the handful of innovations being brought to the table. Because surprise! Making innovations doesn't auto-qualify a game for being good. Sick. Now your timestamps are on screen, and let's begin this autopsy of the set of games which perfectly embody how not to build a Pokemon game. Where else to start but the biggest embarrassment of the game itself, the Johto region. Here we are gifted a region that suffers from fidelity issues in the gameplay, route design, Pokemon selection, and really just about anywhere you can think. But mostly that comes from the devs needing to shove everything into what's basically 3/4 of a region, and then trying to give the player freedom of choice to absolutely ruin what flow the game could have had, as Johto itself goes in a relatively linear loop before reaching a point where you can choose between two paths. Yes, both are required to beat the game, and after doing both, you go on a pointless detour before going forward around to the starting town and heading towards Kanto for the Pokemon League. All around, Johto itself is a pretty bland and simple experience, and itself is hardly worth batting an eye towards, which is fine as Johto is not the only region in the game, for better or for worse, as Kanto manages to show up at the end of the game's first act and for the entirety of the second act, and is once again more play-space because Gold and Silver were direct sequels to Red and Blue, not just an unrelated entry in the series. Here's the thing. I just said Kanto was added for better or for worse. In theory, that should never be an issue. It should always be for better. But people seem to forget, to force in so much extra content, a lot of trade-offs were required to make it work. Look no further than the level curve, or any other forms of gameplay structure. Example 1. Johto is such an underbaked region, its identity is just living in the shadow of Kanto rather than having its own real identity, because there's just nothing here other than recycling way too many Pokemon from Kanto while neglecting its own new Pokemon. Example 2. Its over-reliance on Kanto to make the game not suck. As we'll talk about with the level curve later, it leaves Johto with pitifully low-level trainer Pokemon to make up for the 2-act game. But when we get to Kanto, surprise! The level curve here is also horrific, and barely progresses, defeating the entire point of handicapping the level curve in Johto. Example 3. It leads to a misconception, making people believe that more bad content is better than less good content, aka the quantity over quality debate. And of course, example number 4. Oh my god, guys! 2 regions! Overall, the decision to have 2 regions, despite being a great idea, ultimately caused a lot more problems than it fixed. But off that note, sacrifices were made to bring Kanto back, aka the removal of the Seafoam Islands, the gym doesn't count, Cerulean Cave hitting that Bro, finna head out, the Safari Zone getting cancelled, and of course the funniest one, whatever this sad excuse is for a Viridian Forest replacement. It's just not good, and downright one of the most devious things of all time. But you know what's even more devious? Going between the 2 regions, as it's just a chore, because the logical play of just flying between the 2 regions does not work, so the options across the borders are just annoying. So in Act 1, you can only go from Kanto from surfing up from Newbark Town and following the road. That's it, nice and simple. However, getting back to Johto on the other hand is limited due to you talking to this guy in his Abra, because of course, flying does not work. You are trapped here. And if you do teleport with the Abra, surprise, you have to walk all the way back to the Pokemon League, so odds are you'll never do this. However, Act 2 and the post-game are more annoying and more complicated. Going from Johto to Kanto, you have a boat that only runs on certain days of the week. You have a train that you'll probably never use to actually visit Kanto, or flying to Mount Silver and going right, the only good method. Now leaving Kanto on the other hand, you won't be leaving on foot, I'll tell you that much right now. So you have 2 options, the boat, which again only runs on certain days, or the train because the game is obsessed with Kanto and they want you to stay here forever. Okay, speaking of forever, we got a mechanic that adds some spice to the game and is relatively annoying. That, of course, being the day-night cycle, which changes the time as well. Time goes on, changing wild encounters and, more importantly, the day of the week, as certain events can go down on certain days of the week. How thrilling and awesome. The issue is you can't really change the day or time manually. Waiting for certain things to happen can be a problem. Speaking of issues, we go to a minor one that plagues the first 6 generations of Pokemon. HMs! This time around there are 7 HMs and 5 are mandatory to beat the game. Of course being 6 if you actually want to use Fly. So yeah, now it's time to stress out once you reach the 5th gym, and then you wonder why you don't have strength because they suck it in a random building across the ocean that you are never going to go to naturally. But hey, this is me getting a little ahead of myself, as this is of course a replayability issue, which means we can just slide our way over there now, huh? Remember, it only gets worse from here. Now, you'd expect a game with 2 acts to have a pretty damn good sense of replayability, and in theory, you would be correct. But of course, in actual execution, this was absolutely not the case, as these games are absolutely abhorrent in terms of replayability. Yes, this is the game that had 16 gyms and a pretty large Pokédex, so pulling that off is pretty impressive, but not in a good way. So first, let's speak on the mess that is the Pokédex and Pokemon variety. Gold and Silver bring us a meaty Pokédex of 250 Pokemon, being all of them kind of, as across the 2 games, every Pokemon but the Kanto starters, the 2 evolving fossils, and the Kanto legendaries are all unobtainable. Sounds good, right? Well, things get problematic as you consider the game being broken into 2 parts, as quite a lot of Pokemon are not available until you beat the Pokemon League. So, the second half of the game. But to remind you, this area is all Kanto, no extra Johto areas. So the idea of Pokemon that are supposed to live in Johto being native to the region, not living there, is a bit of a sin, which is another problem as so many Pokemon get regulated to the game's second act. New mons like Murkrow, Misdreavus, Sneasel, Magcargo, Houndoom, Porygon 2, and Blissey, while returning mons like Raichu, Dugtrio, Dodrio, Rapidash, Muk, Marowak, Rhydon, Kangaskhan, Mr. Mime, Electabuzz, Aerodactyl, and finally the best Pokemon in the game are all regulated to Kanto. Now, while some are gotten earlier than others, being placed right before the Elite Four, most of these are after beating the Pokemon League. So, most of the game and what people mislabel as the entire main game. And it also sucks as the Pokemon I just listed are horribly spread out among the Pokédex, a feature designed to show all the Pokemon in an order in which Pokemon are encountered within the game. Look at the Hoenn, Univon, Kalos games for good examples. Meanwhile, here you see Magmar, who's early-ish enough in the game, and then you see Electabuzz right there near it. Organization aside, delaying such a massive pool of Pokemon serves as an absolutely dreadful experience, made worse by the levels of the wild Pokemon in these areas. Hell yeah, partner, I love getting a level 4 Pikachu just in time for Red. But here's the kicker, as these aren't even all the Pokemon being delayed this long in the game. Other than the legendary on the other game's box art, all of the Pokemon evolved from the Fire, Water, Leaf, and Thunderstones are obnoxiously locked, surprise, in Kanto, again after you beat the Pokemon League. So if you wanted a Cloyster, Jolteon, Exeggutor, or Starmie, you'd have to patiently wait until after beating the Pokemon League, in which you can get a single version of each stone once. All of these restrictions arbitrarily limit how you're going to build your team in-game, and while considering how many of the other Pokemon in the game are just generally bad. And yes, this is also after considering HMs as well. So now you get to sit here and build the true Gold and Silver team. Diamond and Pearl, for instance, memes into this travesty. But you ask, what about Gold and Silver? Well, buddy, it's simple. The best team is right here. 3 entire Pokemon, because the game selection is horrible, and EXP is the most dreadful thing to get in-game. You have your starter, the free shiny everyone catches, your reason for disliking Pokemon Crystal, your cut user, your surf user to actually get and teach surf to the Gyarados, and a flyer because you want to speedrun this game as fast as possible to make the suffering end. Now, oh boy, it's time for the fun part, as now that your horrible team is built, we can talk about the dreadful experience that is actually playing the game. Now, if you've ever heard anything negative about the Johto games, it's probably the level curve. Listen, if you can make a level curve of Diamond and Pearl look like it isn't awful, then you've done something wrong, as the first 4 gyms in terms of levels work fine. It's not great, but it works. Of course, the one exception selection being the first gym starting in single digits. Also, this gym is not hard, just level up your team, or seize the fight with the Fury Cutter TM, and quit making a fool of yourself. But bad news, because one of the game's core design ideas now comes into play. The idea of non-linearity, as of course, as you beat the 4th gym, the world opens up and 2 choices present themselves. But here we have a problem. The game's pacing just comes to a screeching halt as 3 entire gyms are spread along 2 split paths, which means the level curve has to stop and take both paths into consideration, which means you have to deal with these absolutely pitiful generic trainer levels with 0 sense of progression. But secondly, a big issue starts to rise as for some reason the 6th gym leader level-wise actually outclasses the 7th, completely killing the purpose of just following the gym order, as the levels just jump all over the place. Before, of course, the level curve attempting to come back just in time for the 8th gym and the Elite Four, where the latter we see another case of Elite Four level laddering, with the first half of the game ending at level 50. Now, while it may be functional for the first 4 gyms, it falls apart massively once you reach the 2 paths that are supposed to help the game's replayability. But if the level curve struggles, then they have created an issue greater than your choice. Like, look at the level of the radio tower grunts. The amount of Pokemon above level 30 is staggering low, and this is after the 2 routes join up, which is very problematic. Even looking forward, we see the final pre-Elite Four rival fight having a full team that level-wise pales in comparison to the 8th gym, who at this point you've already beaten. Now, ignoring the Elite Four and pushing on to Act 2 of the game, we see an absolute disaster, as there's another 8 gyms of varying levels, and out of the 8 gyms, only a single gym leader ever gets above level 50 on any Pokemon. Obviously, this gym serves to be the final challenge in Kanto, but the problem is, just as you had a choice after the 4th gym, you get to decide between the order of the 8 Kanto gyms. Yes, in this game, for some reason, all 8 of them, giving you the ability to fight Blue immediately, and then indulging in all the pushover gym leaders, and then finally deciding to battle the biggest joke in the game last. Janine, what the hell did they do to your team? This twisted joke doesn't even get levels above Claire. To call her a pushover doesn't even do enough justice to how free this battle actually is. And the fact that this isn't even the first gym you see in Kanto is another problem. You have to go out of your way to even reach her. But hey, enough bullying the gym leaders. The final rival battle doesn't even beat out the Elite Four in levels either. Serves as another disappointment in the can. And of course, that leaves us with Red. Who thought this was okay? Grinding levels in these games are already one of the most dreadful tasks ever due to the absolutely pitiful levels on the wild Pokemon throughout the entire game, but they just expect you to get into the mid-70s to even be remotely on par with them. This is just never going to happen. But now you would expect me to be done with this whole section and just move on to the post-game offering. But no, I haven't even glanced at the Pokemon on the Johto gym leaders, as half of them don't even feature any Johto Pokemon on their teams. What, were they too afraid that the new Mons were bad? Hoothoot is already the same type as Pidgey, so why is it not here on Faulkner's team instead? My brother in Christ, Bugsy, you have not 1, but 2 wasted team slots. 2 of the new bugs in the game are already bad. Why are they not here? Well, it's because like the other 4 bug types in the game, Game Freak just simply pretended they didn't exist at all. How? Chuck sure does exist, huh? But Morty, explain to me why there's an entire ghost gym that was completely incapable of featuring the only new ghost type on any of their teams. You won't even see the damn thing until the final location in the entire game. And that Pokemon's not even good in the first place. Okay, fine. Now that I've pointed out so many of the unbelievable flaws these games feature, let's just move on before I have an aneurysm, because we'll be doing this again real soon once Crystal comes into the equation. So let's drain this pool and see what endgame content is left. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, before we speak on the post-game, I needed to remind you that the game is broken into 2 distinct parts of the main game. Important to note, as this would imply the entire Kanto section of the game is not actual post-game, of course going in favor of this being a 2-act game. Instead of being this large post-game blowing out of proportion the amount of content that you would actually expect to see. Because when you look at the game through this lens, there is literally nothing left in terms of actual post-game content. Because the worst part is, the rival rematch isn't even post-game content. You can do it immediately after the final rival fight, which is a problem because there is no true post-game content. Once Red is beat, you unlock nothing new. But don't worry, Buttercup. Let me spoon feed you some of the new small pieces of side content, starting with the Game Corner, which isn't even new. But look at that, you can buy coins here, fun! Moving to less obvious stuff is the Pokegear, which allows you the ability to rebattle some trainers you've previously beaten, or to get harassed every so often by pointless phone calls that you have no ability to turn down while you suffer. But at least you're not required to register the phone numbers at all, unlike a certain game. And thanks to what basically serves as a bank, you can get extra special items that can be used to decorate your room. Completely pointless, but cute, I guess. The next feature has a new mechanic tied to it, being genders and breeding. Genders hardly have any gameplay impact, or at least in this generation, as it's tied to one attack. But of course the feature's main purpose is for use in breeding, where you can leave 2 Pokemon in a daycare, and if the Pokemon have compatible genders and egg groups, they can make an egg with one of those Pokemon in it. It's a neat addition, however in its debut generation, it only really helps with the Pokedex and nothing really else. And finally, the bug catching contest. On 3 days of the week, you can participate in a contest that's absolutely not rigged in an effort for you to find a rare bug type and to get second place to a Weedle. And that is all the game really offers in terms of post-game content. A whole lot of nothing. Oh fun, the mechanical changes. Here more than ever was it needed. After all, the Gen 1 battle system was so damn scuffed, enough to the point where you would assume it was being held together with sticks and tape. Now Gold and Silver comes in and improves quite a bit of the battle system. So the most obvious addition is the new types in Steel and Dark. 2 types made as a direct response to nerf the completely overtuned typing that Psychic was back in Generation 1, but each comes with their own issues. Dark offensively mimics the Ghost type for some reason in terms of super effective damage, while Steel resists so damn much. So much in fact that not a single Pokemon with the typing is bad. Yes, this includes the only unevolved Steel type. To solve one issue, they made a less severe one. Speaking of the types, the type chart saw some minor tweaks. So as a reminder, this would be Psychic no longer being immune to Ghost, not that it mattered in Gen 1 because nobody was ever clicking Lick. Bug no longer threatens poison types, while Poison no longer threatens Bug back, and of course Fire now resists Ice because the simple idea of ice melting in the water is apparently too impossible for us to comprehend. Another big, important change these games brought was the special stat split, allowing for all Pokemon to have a special attack stat and a special defense stat. A balancing decision that killed the old special stat, which used to just be the 2 stats combined. With this change, all the pre-existing Pokemon needed some minor stat adjustments. The more notable examples would include Flareon becoming weaker offensively, Mewtwo losing some of its bloated bulk, Charizard gaining a slightly stronger offensive presence, and Hitmonlee not collapsing the second you look at it. But this isn't even the game's big innovation. That would be the addition of held items. So while normal items in your bag are just the same as they were, held items exist to be given to a Pokemon to weld the Pokemon's playstyle to your liking. A great addition for the series, but as I'll speak on later, in its first generation, it started pretty rough. On a different note, these games decided to birth easily one of the worst battle formats in Pokemon history in the roaming Pokemon feature. This concept as an idea was good, but in actual execution, it makes PLA's battle system look like a masterpiece. As with this battling experience, a select few Pokemon will roam the region, with their locations changing frequently as you have to chase the Pokemon down the region. When you actually battle the damn thing, the first thing it'll do is it try to run away, which makes battling those Pokemon very hard as they only spawn once, and any kind of damage or status conditions you leave them with will actually carry over to the next time you battle with them, truly making you earn these legendary Pokemon, while making them completely miserable to find and catch as they'll run around to some random part of the map and never approach you, meaning you'll just Master Ball one of them and never go about catching the other 2, which if you think that's bad, just remember Platinum had 5 roaming Pokemon. Now we go from one feature of Pokemon running away to another, as some wild Pokemon, they just have the ability to run away in battle, and at no point during development did they think this was an issue, especially in the game to invent shiny Pokemon. It's like they wanted you to find a shiny Teddiursa that just hits you with that "Aight bro," allowing you to sit there and cry for 15 minutes, and why Legends Arceus brought back this horrible feature, we will never know. Next up, we have another fun fix to Generation 1 with catching, and it is the fact that Pokeballs can no longer miss when trying to catch Pokemon, because that extra piece of RNG was toxic. This next small addition hardly affects gameplay most of the time, being happiness. It is an invisible mechanic that really only has effects on 2 attacks and some some evolutions. Immersive? Sure, but it's annoying even more. Next is some status conditions getting some minor adjustments. First is freeze, being improved to allow any Pokemon to actually be able to remove the status condition during their turn, allowing the Pokemon another chance to play the game instead of being KO'd, but not really, fixing what was otherwise a completely broken status condition. Sleep was improved to not completely eat the turn of your Pokemon on the turn they wake up on, meaning if your Pokemon is slower, you're not going to get stuck in a sleep loop and never get to play the game. Burn was also changed to do more damage between turns, being made stronger from what we saw in Generation 1. We also see critical hits get standardized to a single set percentage chance of appearing instead of being tied to a Pokemon speed stat. Shiny Pokemon were added to the game, a very, very rare chance in which your arrangement of pixels will be a different color. And it's so awesome, since literally any Pokemon can have a shiny variant. Now, other than a few small additions or reworks, we've talked on the important adjustments. Now I get to explain the minor issues with the battling system, by using the competitive scene as a small example. Just two things of note the competitive players have to deal with: the EV system and the items themselves. Now on paper, items don't seem bad, but when you look at the selection, an issue arises. And that's the fact there's only two objectively good item choices in the entire game, being Leftovers and Thick Club. Everything else sadly falls into gimmick territory. And considering one of these two good items is exclusive to two Pokemon, means basically every other Pokemon just wants Leftovers, which completely defeats the purpose of items being experimenting in variety, as of course most of the items are just very ineffective. An issue limited to Generation 2 alone. Thankfully, you can only get 2 Leftovers per save file. Now, the EV system on the other hand is just gross. It's the same as it was in Red and Blue, so in a perfect world, your Pokemon could have a completely maxed out EV spread where all 6 stats get completely capped, which of course leads to overly bulky Pokemon, ones that are in theory supposed to hit harder, and they all invalidate speed as roughly everything has the same speed investment, only ever really broken up by the potential of running the most dreadful attack ever. Right, Hidden Power debuted in this game and it was tied to DVs, actually giving a reason to not run perfect DVs. So maybe that could influence stats. Same would apply to shiny Pokemon, which are given fine stats, but they are never competitively viable. Although it doesn't really matter as DVs are typically not the issue, as of course the EV system is, of course bloating the stats of the Pokemon and making games last longer. How fun! And totally not what makes Snorlax a nightmare to deal with alongside items, hazards, and broken sleep mechanics. But in terms of the gameplay skeleton, that's about it. So let's move on, or something. We can't bury the game just yet. Moving towards the graphics and music, it's just fine. The music is stuck in that purgatory of being fine, nothing too special, and in some cases forgettable. Just a mixed bag of being good enough, with nothing to write home about. Now somewhere to speak is the graphics, now looking a whole hell of a lot nicer than the Generation 1 games did. You know, something about the overworld having actual color and detail is really nice. Unlike that clever idea in Generation 1 we saw of making everything color based on a location, which was just bad on the eyes. Also, trainer models and Pokemon models just generally look better, which really shouldn't come off as a surprise, but hey, it's worth noting as there's really nothing else to say in this entire section other than what? More sprites on your Pokemon menu? Overall, the music and graphics just simply got better, to an extent that's really not worth freaking out over. Oh fun, the story! Easily the most nothing part of the whole game, which says a lot granted everything I've said up to this point. But hey, if there's anything this game has taught me, it always gets worse. Which only hurts more because this is a sequel to Red and Blue, slightly continuing off its story. So, the story begins with you being requested by Professor Elm to go pick up a very important thing for his research. And he gives you a starter to go fetch his damn egg that totally won't be a waste of time. You reach the house, get an egg, and good news, buddy. Professor Oak is here to exclusively advance the plot as he gives you a Pokédex so you have an actual reason to go out on this adventure and touch grass. Everything looks all fine and dandy before Professor Elm calls you about a Pokemon being stolen from his lab. And then you head back before some clown acting fool shows up and battles you. And after mopping the floor with him, you go back to the lab as a police report is being filed, as of course you just battled the person who did the crime. So after giving your rival a completely accurate name, you give Elm the egg, and finally begin the adventure, and from this point, the story basically falls apart as the two narrative pieces from this point onwards just suck, as both are just the incarnation of pettiness, being the sad return of Team Rocket and the rival who I would absolutely never forget to talk about. No, you're just remembering it wrong. So first, Team Rocket, making their not so grand return after the events of the Generation 1 games, where Team Rocket was disbanded, and now they attempt to stage a grand return despite only appearing 3 times in the Johto section of the game, as you stop their operation of smuggling Pokemon tails, breaking into their base, and of course their most ambitious plan of taking over a radio tower to bring their old leader back. Of course, even if you didn't stop all these nameless admins in the end, did you really think Giovanni would return? Absolutely not. That means this game would have an actual climax, which means people would actually care about the story, and we can't have that now, can we? So all that build up with Team Rocket just ends up going to waste after stopping their ultimate plan. That's it. They just all disappear, and that's literally it. Until Kanto, or a lone grunt, shuts down power across the whole region, doing far more harm than the entire organization did throughout the rest of the entire game. And here, you're given the option to battle him. Not battling him will keep the secret that Team Rocket has disbanded a second time from him, but battling him, of course, brings the truth to light as he just simply fades away to never be seen again. Especially not as a generic NPC in a completely unrelated region. Totally not. Now to finish off the story, we're choosing to look at the rival. On the surface, he's just like the Gen 1 rival. Arrogant and all that other stuff people like in their rivals. But underneath the surface, surprise, he's also just like the Generation 1 rival, just with different build-up. Basically, he just wants to be the strongest trainer around while despising weak trainers, like Team Rocket and you, despite you beating him multiple times. But now where you get deja vu is when the champion beats him in battle, leaving the idea in his mind that he needs to love his Pokemon to be a good trainer, what we see in Gen 1 after becoming the champion. However, here we see a little more of that premise, as despite seeing attempts at growth in the Mount Moon battle, his rematch team is where you actually see his progress, as his Golbat was actually able to evolve through the power of friendship. How wholesome. Although, one minor thing to note, that feeling of growth, as it's supposed to be an underlying theme throughout the whole game. But you knew that already, right? Because this is something we also saw in Red and Blue, X and Y, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, Sword and Shield, Legends Arceus, Black and White, Sun and Moon, and you see where I'm going at, right? Gold and Silver is just one of the 20 mainline games with a focus on growth over the course of your adventure, and the 2-region setup just makes it a little easier to see. Now, my final remarks for the story is it's serviceable and nothing more than that, as Team Rocket's inclusion in the game was fumbled so badly, just being used for fan service, providing you something that you'd have to fight, while the rival is the most cookie-cutter example of a rude rival being turned by the ideology of believing in your allies will allow you to reach your full potential. In this case, being the Pokemon themselves, which means we are done with the story and finally put these games to rest. You read the title, you've seen just about everything to the game. Pokemon Gold and Silver are a disaster. Games in theory that could have been great had the Pokemon variety, the level curve, and the everything else had not been dragging it down. Listen, there's still plenty wrong with the game that I haven't even mentioned yet that just comes off as low-hanging fruit. Like how Typhlosion and its evolution line actually have their stats copy and pasted from the Charizard evolution line, or Feraligatr is just missing an entire letter between the T and the R of its name. But why bother when it doesn't even hurt the actual game's experience? Unlike the Moon Ball, which was programmed wrong to increase the catch rate of Pokemon that evolved from burn heals. Yep, it doesn't provide any benefits at all, serving as more fire for the flame. But I digress. Gold and Silver are a mess of good ideas, bogged down by bad game design, like an overemphasis on level grinding, locking a bunch of evolutions behind Act 2, a very underwhelming story with zero payoff, or my favorite, the biggest jokes for trainers the series has ever seen. Games with too much ideas that were not dealt a good hand, with the real success being limited to mechanical changes, and the addition of the move deleter, which has not even been mentioned up to this point. But on another note, these games made this one of the hardest videos for me to make, because the simple process of just playing the game sounded so miserable. Like, how off-putting can a game be to make you want to complete the Pokédex in its remake instead to avoid playing the game? I can't say that other than Gold and Silver, which means, of course, my final thoughts. Don't play it. it. Even if the remakes never existed, Pokemon Crystal being the same game with a pinch of extra content invalidates Gold and Silver from the question entirely. And for a score, a 2.8 out of 10 is reasonable considering the games being more bad than they are good, which is an issue if I can struggle to say if it's better or worse than the Generation 1 games. And if you somehow still disagree at this point, I can make an argument that we can all get behind. Ready? Dibs. I call dibs. I won the argument. The games are bad. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, drop a like, consider subscribing, and maybe leave a comment on your thoughts about Gold and Silver. I read all the comments. All of this is good for the algorithm, and for someone who can't upload frequently, that would mean the world to me. Pokemon Crystal's next, and what follows that is tricky. But for now, we've reached the end. So as always, I will see you guys in the next one.